Our next regular guest is none other than Eli Medrano from CalHR. Eli works at the CalHR, like I said, at the Office of Civil Rights as an Equal Employment Opportunity Program Manager and advises EEO officers, program coordinators, and relevant stakeholders on the following program. One of the specialty of Eli is limited examination and appointment program, reasonable accommodation, EEO upward mobility. Eli is an advocate for the equitable treatment of person with a disability. We heard a lot about equity, and Eli champions the equitable treatment with person with disabilities. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Eli to unmute and come on board and be our guest. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you for that introduction, and good morning to you and to all the members of SDAC and all the Disability Advisory Committee members from across the state. I see Dan on video as well. So hello, Dan, and to all the ACCED members. And thank you again for having us in this very important venue for CalHR. My division chief, Glenna Wheeler, is actually at the California Civil Rights Officers Council meeting. We have a regular appearance at that meeting as well. So she is in that venue, but she extends her warm regard to all of you. So I'd like to start with the limited examination and appointment program statistics, starting with the appointment numbers. So as of last night, we've had 15 individuals appointed through LEAP since the beginning of the year. And of course, we expect that number to rise as the year progresses. I do want to give a recap in regard to the last quarter, October to December of 2022. We had a total of 39 individuals appointed through LEAP. And at the end of the fiscal year, I will give a report as well in terms of the total number of LEAP appointees and compare that with the previous fiscal year so that we'll have an opportunity to have that comparative analysis. There are a total of 62 LEAP exams posted on the web, and there shouldn't be a mystery in terms of how to locate that list or how to use that list. So at the end of my brief talk, I will post the link to the LEAP exams on the chat, along with other resources, because again, we look unto you, the Disability Advisory Committee members, SDAC, as our partners in terms of promoting LEAP, in terms of providing education and information to those individuals who may not be as familiar with LEAP or any other disability-related matters. So we do want to remain partners on that particular regard. And speaking of partnership, I do want to give a special shout out to our colleagues at the Department of Rehab, especially Shannon Coleman, the EEO officer at Rehab, and a special thank you to DOR's Interpreter Coordinator Unit for their continued partnership with CalHR's Office of Civil Rights, especially in times of need. And we do encourage all other departments to use us, CalHR, as an example in Rehab in terms of sharing resources and expertise with one another. And I do echo what SPB said earlier, that, you know, we, in a way, I mean, SPB didn't say it this way, but we're one state family, and we should share resources. We need to share information. And there's a wealth of information out there that many departments are willing to share and should be sharing with others as well. So a quick reminder in terms of collaboration. And also, speaking of collaboration and speaking of DOR as well, we partnered with DOR's Workforce Development Unit in terms of updating the LEAP brochures. Many departments have inquired with CalHR's Office of Civil Rights in regard to the availability of LEAP brochures. Because, you know, even at the age of remotely connecting with one another, even at the time when many individuals are fluent in terms of technology, virtual technology, there are individuals who may prefer to have a hard copy of certain documents. And so we have partnered with Rehab in regard to updating that brochure. And so for more information in regard to requesting LEAP brochures, please contact DOR and I will provide you the link as well to their workforce development unit. They are, I believe, in the final stages of the production for the LEAP brochures. But as I've said, I will provide you the information. So along with the LEAP brochures, there are tons of other information and resources posted on the web in regard to LEAP, in regard to reasonable accommodation. In fact, we recently updated the LEAP coordinators checklist and the LEAP FAQs. And those are documents that we at CalHR's Office of Civil Rights actually produce, and we manage those documents. So there is a January 2023 update. So it's very hot and very freshly published. So those are available on the web. I will provide you the resources as well on the chat box. As you may be able to tell, we are somewhat the resource capital of the California State Service, especially in regard to civil rights information. So feel free to reach out to your EEO officer if you have any questions in regard to LEAP, reasonable accommodation, disability, persons with disability representation, or other related matters. Your EEO officer have a direct contact with us, CalHR's Office of Civil Rights, and they consult with us in regard to these types of matters. So that's basically what I have prepared as far as information that I wanted to share with you, but I do want to provide some clarification as well. Bobby, if it's okay to do that now in regard to some
Absolutely.
statements that were made earlier. So the first one I do want to make is I do want to reiterate the SPB statement in regard to the form being outdated and obsolete. But I do want to clarify, though, that from our perspective, CalHR's Office of Civil Rights, it's the standard 910 form. And I'm not familiar with the 610. It may be in existence, but I would admit to you, I'm not familiar with the form 610. But if you contact CalHR, the advisement that we will provide departments and what we've been providing is that the standard form 910, which is the form that was not developed by CalHR, but we are assisting in providing advisement because, again, we are partners with other state agencies, and the advisement that we provide is very concise. The form is obsolete and should not be used for any purpose. And for any additional questions or concerns regarding the form 910, please contact your EEO officer or your legal office. If what you're looking for is in regard to reasonable accommodation, there's a separate process that addresses reasonable accommodation, and many departments have standard forms or forms that they use pertaining to the reasonable accommodation application. So we advise you to go toward that route. And again, consult with your EEO officer regarding these types of matters. The second thing that I do want to address is in regard to statistics. And pardon me if you've attended previous SDAC meetings and you've already heard me say this, but CalHR's Office of Civil Rights, we are the office that manages statewide discrimination complaint data. And this is per government code. State agencies are required to report their discrimination complaint data to a statewide database that is managed by CalHR. And the statistics for 2020, it's been published, and it's located on CalHR's Office of Civil Rights webpage. And we do not have specific information in regard to reasonable accommodation denials, because that was the question that was posed earlier. However, we do have available statistics in regard to disability discrimination complaints. And based on the complaint data that was reported in the discrimination complaint tracking system in 2020, discrimination complaints based on disability ranked as number 3 statewide, and that was at 14.3%. and it ranked as number 4 in terms of those complaints that were substantiated on a statewide basis. And again, this information is based on the data submitted by departments into the CalHR's discrimination complaint tracking system. So that's a quick statement on that particular matter. And then I believe it was Susan that asked about the relationship between the Disability Advisory Committee and the advisement for the director. And she's correct. Per government code, and specifically government code section 19795, section B, it does state that the Disability Advisory Committee advises departmental directors in terms of issues regarding employees with disabilities. We have a particular section of the Human Resources Manual in CalHR's webpage that talks about the relationship between the EEO officer and the Disability Advisory Committee. And yes, that is of leadership and guidance. And I will provide you the link to that particular statewide policy as well. And then in regard to RA policy development, CalHR is actually the leader and is leading that charge in terms of developing the reasonable accommodation policy. And in fact, CalHR drafted that policy, and it's currently being reviewed and vetted, including stakeholders that are involved in the process. In regard to reasonable accommodation leadership and advisement, CalHR's Office of Civil Rights provides that on a statewide basis. So if you have any questions or concerns regarding reasonable accommodation, again, I do encourage you to work with your EEO officers. And on most cases, especially for departments that are small, the EEO officer is likely the one facilitating the reasonable accommodation process as well. Or on those cases when the EEO officer is not the RA coordinator, the EEO officer is expected to also be a subject matter expert in regard to reasonable accommodation. So please feel free to reach out to your EEO officer for guidance, for clarity in regard to RA, LEAP, or any other matters related to the representation of persons with a disability. So that's what I have for you, and I would be glad to respond to any questions related to the matters that I spoke about. Thank you again, Bobby. And Susan, hello and good morning as well to you.
Thank you, Eli. We have Dan Clark with his hand raised. Dan, please go ahead, unmute, ask your question.
You referenced, and I think AB 313 directed you to have this RA policy out. I know there was a draft before all this. They were trying to get it out. They weren't sure they can get it out because it wasn't so in law, and so now it was an AB 313. And we've been given feedback. I mean, do you have any idea when it's going to come out? Because I think earlier discussion, I could hear people saying, talking about their RA policies and so forth. And I know they're trying to develop their own, but just provide guidance. Do you have an idea how soon that will be out?
Thank you, Dan, for that question. So yes, AB 313 did provide the mandate and did provide you authority for CalHR to take that leadership role as far as the development and dissemination of a statewide RA policy. It also gave us the authority to make sure to check on departments that they do have an existing reasonable accommodation policy and that it's an effective policy. In fact, a month after, actually even lesser than a month after AB 313 was signed into law, because I led that charge, I worked with a colleague in terms of reaching out to state agencies. And in that survey, in our initial survey, about 85% already had an existing and implemented reasonable accommodation policy. And we checked with them. And I think the last time we checked, about 97% had a reasonable accommodation policy that was developed approved and in place. So, and we continue to partner with other state agencies in regard to that. So the statewide RA policy is in development. It's been developed, it's been drafted, and stakeholders are reviewing it. But as far as an actual date for its release, I do not have that information yet. As you all know, for statewide policies, it takes time, especially for RA, for a very important policy. So, but as soon as it's ready, as soon as it's available, we will let you know. Bobby will be one of the first people that I contact, when it's ready to be released. The thing, though, that I do want to remind everyone is, even in the absence of a statewide policy, it doesn't, in a way, remove each department's responsibility to have a reasonable accommodation policy of their own. It doesn't remove the responsibility to make sure that they are ensuring an effective, reasonable accommodation program. It's mandated by law that departments engage in an interactive process, that departments facilitate the reasonable accommodation process in a timely fashion and in good faith. So it's in the works, and as I've said, we will let you know when it is ready to be released and published. Thank you, Dan, for that question.
I just have a couple of questions for you, Eli. Thank you again for a wealth of information and clarifying
Of course.
a couple of points you raised earlier. A couple of things I want to focus on, one of which you mentioned the discrimination tracking data that you get, and that data is actually furnished by the departments. So whatever data that you receive are put into that database and reflected as presented, correct?
Yes, the statistics that I reported and what we publish on our webpage are based on information provided by department EEO officers, EEO investigators, what they enter into the database.
So essentially it's a self-reported data that you just publish, correct?
That is correct. So each department, they're expected to enter their complaint data in an accurate fashion. That is the expectation from them. It is an obligation that did not. We, CalHR's Office of Civil Rights, we are agents in terms of asserting that responsibility, but that originates from statutes, and the governor's office supports and asserts that responsibility for each state agency as well.
The other follow-up question I have for you, I know you mentioned that anytime there is issues with reasonable accommodation or any of the other EEO program, they should contact their EEO officer. And oftentimes EEO officers do their level best. They're great professionals. They sincerely believe in the cause and try to do the right thing. Oftentimes they run into barriers from executive, from management, from their peers of executing what they know that is the right thing to do. When they run into those barriers, they really don't have anywhere else to turn to, and they're caught between this difficult position of having to execute the will of whoever that they're dealing with and trying to accomplish the right, effective, reasonable accommodation for the client that came to, seek their assistance. How do you manage that relationship and that complexity of environment? In other words, not everyone can just, wave this magic wand and make things disappear and make things happen. And EEO officers are no exceptions to that. And they have a very challenging job oftentimes because they're caught between two places. And how do you manage that?
Yes, EEO officers, they do indeed have a very difficult job. And many of them are very talented. I shouldn't say many. I'm assuming all of them are very talented. All of them are kind individuals, because otherwise they wouldn't be in this role as the EEO officer. Because if you do not have the passion, if you do not have the expertise, you're going to be miserable in your role as the EEO officer. However, if you have the passion, if you have the expertise, just like as DAC or SDAC members do for these particular issues, you will thrive in the role of the EEO officer. And as far as someone to turn to, they have us, they have the director. We are available for EEO officers. And in fact, they have an amazing consultant in regard to reasonable accommodation and LEAP. I'm partly kidding, partly not, because I'm the consultant for RA. So I do want to assert the fact that CalHR's Office of Civil Rights, we are composed of a team of experts in regard to reasonable accommodation, in regard to LEAP, upward mobility, language services, in terms of workforce analysis, and again, in terms of the discrimination complaint data as well, which we handle. We're humans as well, and we would admit if it's something that we have not encountered, and we will research it. But in most cases, the questions that are posed onto us are, questions that we've seen before, or questions that we've researched, and we are able to provide resources to EEO officers and reasonable accommodations in regard to, especially those cases that may, trump them in terms of their, decision-making processes. And so we are always available to provide consultation to EEO officers on that particular regard.
The other question I have as a follow-up relates to the AB 313 and the implementation of that and having a model reasonable accommodation policy. If I understand, and please correct me, the AB 313 gives CalHR the authority to create and develop this model policy. And the first step CalHR looks at, simply ask all the departments, do you have a policy of reasonable accommodation? And if they say yes, then you mark that and you take that into part of the statistic. I think you said like 85% or some departments already have a policy, correct?
Actually, that was on the initial survey.
Oh, okay.
But as of the last time that we checked, it's above 95.
Okay.
I'm 96, 97, but I will have to check. But it's already at the 90s, stages. So again, it's in a way part of how I would like to assure the SDAC community that even at this time, and again, it's not an excuse, because again, it takes time, to develop a policy, especially on the statewide level. But even in the absence of a statewide policy, your department should have a reasonable accommodation policy. And if your department doesn't, contact me, contact us, and we will follow up with them. But as I've said, we do have a record in regard to which departments already have a policy in place and which departments are in the development stages. And most of the departments who are in the development stages are those departments who are either brand new, who are newly formed, or had a change of administration and wanted to completely update their RA policies. So there are explanations for why they do not have their policies approved and published yet.
So let's say that 100% of them come up with a policy, or they report that they have, and that's great. That's great news that they have one. How do you know that that's effective policy? Because obviously their self-reported data shows they've got complaints related to that, some percentage of reasonable accommodation. You've got SPB who actually monitors reasonable accommodation complaints. So there is still a problem segment out there. So how CalHR is going to ensure that those 97 or 100% of those policies are effective?
This is where our partnerships with you as DAC and the EEO officers with ACSED and the departmental disability advisory committees really become very important, because you are our partners in terms of assisting that these processes are indeed effectively being administered in your departments, because we're not everywhere. We can't be anywhere. And I mean, we can't be everywhere. But we do want to provide assistance on a universal basis in regard to civil rights within the state of California. So if you, and I'm referring to the collective you as the DAC, see issues in regard to your RA process, speak with your EEO officer, engage in that dialogue. Provide your EEO officer an opportunity to engage in that dialogue with you, because sometimes it may be a misunderstanding. Sometimes there may be some information that may not have been available to you. And then, remind them that, Eli, speaks at SDAC and he constantly points to us working with you.
Yeah.
And if you would like, invite your EEO officer to have a dialogue with CalHR.
Okay.
So again, we work together in terms of monitoring that these programs, the RA, LEAP, and other programs related to the representation of persons with a disability are effective. And in fact, and this too is because of statutory developments and also because of the climate in terms of cultural awareness, in terms of mindfulness in regard to these matters, and it's public information, so I could share it. Our Office of Civil Rights, is expanding, and we actually have specific positions now dedicated to compliance. So that particular responsibility of CalHR's Office of Civil Rights will become even more robust, because we will actually have staffing now to work with departments, to check with departments in regard to their PWD representation, in regard to LEAP, in regard to RA, in regard to upward mobility. So this is not to scare departments, but it's to help you become more accountable. And also it's statutorily mandated. But yes, I'm very excited about that particular development involving our office.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that your BCPs for staffing got approved, and now you have, a few more bodies to enforce all this. That's great news. Now, Lori Gillihan from State Personnel Board, who appeared earlier, has a comment here. It says, Eli, there was a suggestion about having a disabled individual in the offices of civil rights to ensure RAs are processed. I was going to take that back to SPB, but it might belong to CalHR. What do you think about that? She does have a great point.
Thank you. I think that belongs to all of us. to
Very
the community.
diplomatic and political response, Eli.
And I say it because we are all responsible for promoting the recruitment, the retention, and the promotion of persons with a disability. And of course, we have to follow the merit principle. We still have that as an overarching principle across the state. Yes, we do have the limited examination and appointment program process to assist persons with a disability in the context of an alternative examination process. However, persons with a disability must compete in the same fashion as non-PWD individuals are expected to perform in the interview process. So yes, it would be great to have, not just great, it's ideal, it's expected, it's mandated to have representation, diversity. But as far as, specific statutes or guidelines specifically stating that there should be a particular member of a particular group hired for a particular office, I'm not familiar in terms of such statutory requirements. And in regard to those, SPB would be the experts. I'm not an attorney, and so in terms of the statutory requirements and the mandate for departments to follow, but again, it takes a village. It takes an entire state of committed professionals to ensure that PWD representation is happening, and is happening in a significant way.
And I think the initial question that was presented earlier was couched not based on not following the merit principle and giving preferences to person with disabilities, but more being inclusive and having somebody like a person with disabilities be included in that shop of wherever the reasonable accommodation and EEO matters are being considered for respective entities. So the question was, how do we have more inclusiveness to have person with disabilities be in those offices so they can also share the equitable concerns that they may see that somebody else may not, right? That only enhances the merit principles and the equality and all of that. It doesn't take away or gives any special preference. So that's where that question came from earlier. And we're just trying to see that who can better implement or bring this concern and awareness to all the departments and the relevant parties. That's essentially it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll also bring it back to my office. But yeah, I mean, it's I think a shared responsibility amongst us that starts with recruitment, starts with education, that promotes belongingness across the state, and you know, DEI principles are being implemented across the state. Many state departments have particular offices devoted to DEI. So the state of California is working on it. You know, but as with many processes, it takes time, but it's happening across the state. And by the way, I glanced at the chat box, and I noticed that Kathy from Department of Rehab did post the contact information for the Workforce Development Unit. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Kathy, for your patience with us, with me, in terms of, you know, those collaborative projects that we work on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dora is a great partner with all of this. They do a phenomenal job. Are there any other questions? I think there's another question that's in the chat box. Says, does somebody need to get an RA in order to get ergonomic workstation, for example, chair, stand-up station, arm support, so forth? Do you know the answer to that question, Eli?
Check with your department. You know, departments do it differently. And in terms of ergonomic evaluations, you know, even if it could be part of a reasonable accommodation request, that the particular specifications of, the ergonomic evaluations, that's not my particular area of expertise. So please check with your individual department in terms of, you know, how it's handled. Some may say, oh, actually, we have a unit that specifically handles ergonomic evaluation. You don't need to submit an RA. They will help you out in that. There may be some departments that's like, okay, well, here's the RA form. You don't have to complete the entire section, but we'll just note, just so it's formalized in that way. So check with your EEO officer, check with your RA coordinator, and they will provide you with guidance.
Yes, Mary, I would simply add to what Eli just mentioned. Each department have their respective policies relating to ergonomic evaluation or reasonable accommodation. Each is different, and that's why it's important to have a general policy guidance directing all of this. But check with your department, and they should have one. And if there are any issues you run into, please feel free to contact me. I might be able to share some additional resources in that respect. Any other questions for Eli? If not, I will bid Eli goodbye and thank him for his great presentation. As always, Eli, you know, we learn a lot every time you show up and present. Not only the data and the statistics, but the insight that you offer is very valuable to us. So we really appreciate your continued involvement and partnership. And we look forward to that final release of reasonable accommodation policy whenever that becomes available.
Well, we'll definitely advise you. And thank you so much, Bobby, and to the rest of the SDAC team and to the other DAC members across the state. We thank you for your great work and for your passion. And again, you know, continue to work with your EEO officer, continue with what you're doing, and it's a great partnership that we all have. Thank you so much, and have a nice day. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You too, Eli. Have a great day.